After the war society. The GI Bill is really going to be the landmark post-war era legislation. It's really going to pass without controversy. Technically, the full name of it is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but it's also generally just known as the GI Bill of Rights. This was one of the federal government's most successful public assistance programs. Basically, what it was is rather than giving like cash bonuses to veterans, instead Congress would tie certain benefits for veterans to specific public goals. So it was things like guaranteeing loans of up to $2,000 for buying a house or farm or like starting a business. Keep in mind at this time houses were about $6,000, so that's about a third of the cost. The other thing it did is it encouraged veterans to attend college with like money for tuition or books, plus monthly stipends. And so what this really ends up doing is it makes higher education more accessible for a lot of men with working class backgrounds that never would have dreamt of having this kind of higher education. So by the time you get to 1947, veterans actually make up about half of the college students. The unfortunate part of this is that it also will end up crowding a lot of women out of these classrooms. You see universities limiting like the number of women admitted or barring like out-of-state women to their universities. We're also going to see after the war, there's a huge housing shortage. The thing is, we're going to see that things like a lot of people had saved up money by living with their families during the Great Depression and during World War II leads them to save up money and want to buy their own houses. Also on top of that, things like the Veterans Administration or the VA had basically is going to have mortgage programs and guaranteeing repayment of Veteran Administration loans and allowing veterans to get like home purchasing loans from private vendors without a down payment. So that's a really big thing. And so now there's the potential to buy homes. The problem is people needed homes to buy. And so this is actually going to bring about the so-called Levitt town houses made in about like 1948-ish through 51-ish. And these were originally designed by William Levitt, who was basically a New York builder. And it was a basic structure for a house. There was about 800 square feet, 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom. And so you kind of get this so-called model in a term that a lot of times people use today is like cookie cutter houses. And so we see a lot of other successful builders working on the same kind of scale, that it's identical houses, that the floor plans are simple and easy and square basically. And so in this way, you can have semi-skilled workers construct the houses by knowing one specific process in the house building process. And so basically you're seeing like mass production of housing, but without an assembly line. And so we get other aspects that make home building easier as well, such as things like pre-assembled cabinets. If you've ever gotten a custom-built cabinet or something like that, it's really expensive, but most cabinets today have a pretty much standard size. What this is going to mean is by the end of the 1940s, 55% of American households are going to own their own homes. And this figure, as you can see on this chart, which is the red, is going to continue to rise. It's not until about like 2004-ish that we actually see this number decline for some time, although more recently it's begun to climb again. When we're looking at where people are buying homes, though, we have to look at the suburbs. The thing is, the suburban population is growing the fastest. Central cities are growing a little bit, but population outside of these kind of metropolitan areas, so the rural countryside, is actually going to decline. Now, as much as there's this new housing being built and everything, African Americans oftentimes were excluded from buying these new houses, even though there were many African Americans who wanted to purchase their own homes. Basically, they were kept segregated, still in deteriorating inner city ghettos. Families that were Black that tried to find new homes in like white neighborhoods, maybe on like the edge of Black ghettos, oftentimes would be met with like racial violence, with like rocks thrown through their windows or fire bombs or just angry white mobs. Which really actually brings us to civil rights. That need for housing is one of the things that motivated African Americans to start demanding full rights as citizens. Simultaneously, though, you do see white citizens wanting to reaffirm racial segregation. And so we're actually going to see during this time period, initially after World War II, a surge of racist violence, especially in the South. We are, though, going to see some people are starting to pick up on the irony and the contradiction of that here America was fighting this whole crusade for freedom abroad, and yet racial discrimination still persisted in America. Now, Truman himself, as the leader of the Democratic Party now, is in a bit of a tight spot because on one hand, he's got pressure from Black leaders and wants to uphold civil rights, but on the other hand, that base of the Democratic Party had always been white Southern Democrats. So what he ends up doing is in 1946, he is going to appoint the Committee on Civil Rights. They are going to put forward a report that would basically develop the agenda for racial justice, but it really takes another like 2 decades for this to really be put in effect. Still, we have like the NAACP during this time already begins a campaign of anti-segregation lawsuits, and they're going to have the support of the Justice Department. We are going to see that the Justice Department will order federal housing agencies to modify their racially restrictive policies that initially prohibited, that had prohibited African Americans from buying certain houses. And so the Justice Department is basically prohibiting racial discrimination as well in the federal employment. So you get all these kinds of Supreme Court cases like Shelley v. Kramer in 1948 held that these clauses in real estate deeds that forbid selling or renting to minorities in certain neighborhoods could not be enforced. You could not segregate people that way. We're also going to see things like the president would order equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed services starting in 1948. Now, admittedly, the military is going to drag their feet on this. They tried to limit like Black enlistees, but then we're going to see America gets involved in a lot of other wars like the Korean War and then Vietnam and everything. And this need for manpower basically brings them around. But this is when we start seeing that desegregation of the armed military forces in America. Really, though, if you were going to look at any part of American society that people might have wanted integration more so, it would have been in professional team sports. The thing is, Americans applauded Black champions like Joe Louis, who was a boxer, pictured here, and Jesse Owens, who was a sprinter, also pictured here. But team sports were a lot more complicated because these were individuals competing, but for teams, the team had to practice together, had to travel together, had to play together. One of the most famous integration of sports is going to be in baseball, specifically with Jackie Robinson. In 1947, he became a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and this is breaking that color lines. He wasn't the first, but he's one of the ones that is the longest lasting. And the thing about him is that he endured all this taunting and hostility, and yet he still excelled on the field. This is really going to open the door, and he really becomes this symbol of racial change, especially in baseball. The other way that we're seeing society be affected after the war is the baby boom. So a great example of this is actually my own family. So my grandmother was married to a man who unfortunately went and fought in World War II and died. So she was a widow come the end of World War II. Well, my grandfather actually served in World War II, not on the front lines, but as a tank mechanic. And he came back from the war. He met my grandmother, And 3 months later, they got married. And less than 9 months after that, my aunt was born. So this was very stereotypical. We're going to get a baby boom and family boom at the end of the war. That people have been kind of putting their lives on hold, whether because of the Great Depression or the war, and now they're going forward. And so you get a ton of weddings. And with the marriage rate increasing, we're also going to see a boom of babies. I should make a note, when it comes to marriage, we're going to see a lot of women actually leaving work to get married. And in fact, the median age of women married becomes just over 20 years old. So it actually becomes much younger than it was before. You can see this change in perception of a woman's so-called place in things like popular culture during the 30s versus during the 40s. So for instance, during the 30s, when you have like movies, a lot of times you have these women that are like independent career women, but all the movies in the late like 40s, oh, women are always like the helpless victims, or most often they are the supportive wives. And so once again, we get our marriages, which jumpstarts the baby boom. So how many babies? During the 40s, we're going to average 2.9 million children per year. And in fact, if you look at 1946 through 1950, so the late 40s, the average is actually about 3.6 million per year. That's a lot of babies, and they need diapers, they need swing sets, they need lunchboxes, they need bicycles, they need schoolrooms, etc., etc., etc. And so we're seeing, once again, coming back to kind of more consumerism, because you need all of the household goods to make it easier to have more babies. It's during this time period we get things like Tide, the first synthetic laundry detergent. People just want all of the goods for their households, things from coffee makers to pressure cookers to radios. Looking at all of this video and even the last one, what of these points within after the war do you think have the largest impact on American society? Looking at then and also looking at today.